At the exact moment Washington was still signaling progress through back channels, the market was already reacting as if the war had entered a far more dangerous phase. Brent crude was pushing past $115 a barrel. Not after diplomacy collapsed. Not after a formal declaration. At the same time, in the Strait of Hormuz, tanker captains were still receiving technical clearance to proceed. The route was not officially closed. Navigation systems were still active. Port activity had not stopped. And yet the ships slowed. Some held their lanes. Some reduced speed. Some waited for instructions that never fully answered the real question, because no one was asking whether the corridor was open anymore. They were asking whether it was predictable. Above the water, surveillance aircraft tracked irregular movement patterns. On shore, energy terminals continued loading under alert status. In trading rooms thousands of miles away, prices were moving not in response to confirmed supply loss, but in response to fear that the system itself had become unstable. That was the moment this war stopped looking like a war of strikes alone. It became a war over whether energy could keep moving. And once a war reaches that point, it no longer stays on the battlefield. It enters every system connected to it. The transition into this new phase did not begin with one dramatic explosion. It unfolded across several days, through overlapping actions that hit different parts of the same strategic network before the world had time to process what the previous move meant. On March 25th, Gulf Arab states used unusually stark language at the United Nations Human Rights Council. Iranian attacks on infrastructure in the Gulf, they warned, were not isolated incidents anymore. They described them as a direct threat to national survival. That wording mattered. States do not use language like that lightly, especially not when the infrastructure in question sits at the center of their economic model. Behind those statements was a battlefield pattern already taking shape. Iranian missiles and UAVs had been aimed not at symbolic targets designed for headlines, but at functional targets, sites connected to energy output, storage, transport, and civilian-linked infrastructure. The purpose was not simply to destroy. It was to introduce instability into systems that depend on continuity. Then, on March 27th, the war came physically closer to American personnel. At Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, incoming threats were detected only moments before alarms activated. Radar operators saw the signatures. Warning systems triggered. Personnel moved toward hardened shelter. Interceptors were launched into the night. But the margin was too thin. Not every incoming threat was neutralized in time. 12 American personnel were injured. 2 of them were reported seriously wounded. That was a strategic threshold. Up to that point, Washington could still speak about pressure, deterrence, containment. After Prince Sultan, the war looked different. American forces were no longer standing beside the battlefield. They were inside the strike envelope. Then, before that shock could settle, another axis lit up. On March 28th, Houthi forces in Yemen carried out their first confirmed direct strike on Israel in this phase of the conflict. A front that had been feared now became active. What had looked like separate theaters, the Gulf, Saudi territory, Israel, Yemen, began to merge into one connected battle space. This was not escalation in a straight line. It was escalation through overlap. And overlap is what made the war harder to control. To understand why these events mattered so much, the map has to be read differently. Not as a map of countries, but as a map of flow. At the center of it all sits the Strait of Hormuz, one of the narrowest and most consequential maritime corridors on Earth. At its tightest point, the waterway is only around 30 kilometers wide. But through that narrow space moves roughly 1/5 of global oil and LNG trade. That means Hormuz is not merely a regional route, It is one of the pressure valves of the world economy. Every day, tankers cross it carrying crude and gas from the Gulf to Asia, Europe, and beyond. Japan, South Korea, India, China, and much of the wider global market depend directly or indirectly on that movement continuing without interruption. But Hormuz is only one part of the wider network. To the south lies the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, linking the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden and the Indian Ocean. That corridor matters because it connects shipping not only to the energy trade, but to Europe-bound commercial traffic moving through the Suez route. Once the Houthis became an active strike actor, that southern choke point could no longer be treated as strategically separate from Hormuz. To the north and west are the ports, terminals, export facilities, storage sites, and energy processing nodes spread across the Gulf states. These are the organs of the same system. This is why a missile launched in one place does not remain a local event. A strike near energy infrastructure in the Gulf changes insurance assumptions. A Houthi launch from Yemen affects traffic patterns in another maritime corridor. A threat around Hormuz moves oil futures and trading centers far from the region itself. What we are seeing is not simply war spreading geographically. We are seeing a network being pressured at several points at once. And when networks are pressured simultaneously, the effect is not always immediate collapse. Often it is hesitation. And hesitation inside a strategic system is where disruption begins. At first glance, the weapons in this conflict appear conventional. Ballistic missiles, long-range drones, strike packages designed for range, survivability, and persistent pressure. But if you stop there, you miss what makes this phase of the war different. The real weapon is not just the missile, it is disruption. A ballistic missile aimed at a military base carries one kind of message. A UAV aimed at energy-related infrastructure carries another. The first says, a target can be hit. The second says the system around that target can be made unreliable, and unreliability has strategic value. A refinery does not have to be completely destroyed to lose effectiveness. A pumping station does not have to be turned into ruins to become operationally compromised. A storage facility does not have to burn for days to affect market behavior. In a system built on continuous movement, even limited disruption can trigger wider reactions. That is exactly what began happening between March 27 and March 30. Reuters reporting during this period described Brent crude moving to around $115.55 per barrel, up nearly 60% from late February levels. That price movement did not come from a total halt in Gulf exports. It came from rising belief that the routes and facilities underpinning those exports could no longer be assumed stable. And that distinction matters, because once tanker operators believe risk has increased, they alter behavior. Once insurers reclassify exposure, costs rise. Once markets sense uncertainty in one of the world's most critical choke points, reaction moves faster than physical damage reports. That is why the weapon here is larger than its hardware. The missile hits steel, concrete, or runway. Disruption hits decisions. And decisions are what move the system. The United States and its partners still possess formidable defensive architecture across the region. Layered systems such as Patriot and THAAD are built to detect, track, and intercept incoming threats. Against a clear missile trajectory, they can be highly effective. Radar feeds in the launch. Interceptors calculate flight paths. Seconds later, a response is airborne. That is how air defense is supposed to work. And against a conventional, discrete attack, it often does. But the problem now is that the battlefield has widened beyond what an interceptor can solve. A missile aimed at an airbase can be tracked and challenged. A low-flying UAV approaching a remote energy node may be detected far later. A maritime corridor cannot be intercepted in the same sense at all. And an economy's confidence in a shipping route certainly cannot be shot down by missile defense. This is where the architecture begins to reach its limit. Energy infrastructure is dispersed. It is not one bunker, one command post, one runway, one radar dome. It is ports, storage tanks, terminals, pipelines, junctions, substations, and shipping lanes spread across vast distances. To defend all of it, all the time, against every possible angle of approach is beyond even very advanced systems. But there is an even deeper vulnerability. The most important layer is psychological. You can intercept a projectile. You cannot intercept hesitation. You cannot intercept the moment a tanker captain decides to wait. You cannot intercept the moment an insurer raises the risk classification. You cannot intercept the moment a market stops trusting normal traffic through Hormuz. And when trust breaks, the system begins to change even without a catastrophic strike. That is what makes this phase of the war so difficult to contain. The defense network is not simply being attacked physically. It is being bypassed strategically. Everything in this story pulls back toward one point: Hormuz. Not because it is the only route in the world, but because it is one of the few routes whose instability is enough to send shockwaves everywhere else. Roughly 1/5 of the world's traded oil and LNG moves through this corridor. That is not a statistic that sits neatly in an energy report. It is a strategic fact with immediate human consequences. If movement there becomes uncertain, the price of fuel, shipping, industrial production, and wider supply chains can all begin to change. That is why March 29th mattered so much. Pakistan held high-level discussions focused heavily on the question of reopening or stabilizing traffic through Hormuz and creating a path toward U.S.-Iran talks. At the same time, one signal of limited de-escalation emerged. Iran allowed 20 Pakistan-flagged vessels to pass through the strait. On paper, that looked like a positive sign, but the market did not treat it as resolution. Because stability is not a one-day event. Stability is repetition. Stability is predictability. Stability is the confidence that a vessel moving today will face the same conditions tomorrow. That confidence was gone. And without it, even a technically open corridor can behave like a partially closed one. This is why Hormuz matters more than almost any individual strike site. It is not just a place. It is the hinge between regional conflict and global consequence. Militarily, neither side has produced a decisive result. That fact is central to understanding why the war is becoming more dangerous. U.S. reporting cited during this period suggested that only around 1/3 of Iran's missile stockpile had been confirmed destroyed. That is not insignificant, but it is far from decisive. It means Iran has absorbed punishment, yet still retains enough capability to continue striking bases, threatening infrastructure, and sustaining pressure through direct and proxy-linked fronts. This is where public messaging and battlefield reality begin to diverge. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said Washington believed the war's objectives could be achieved without a U.S. ground invasion of Iran, and that the campaign might last weeks, not months. That statement was designed to project control. But the battlefield data raised a harder question. What if the system keeps widening faster than those objectives can be met? By March 29th, Israel had expanded military operations in southern Lebanon to suppress Hezbollah rocket threats. The Houthis had entered direct fire against Israel from Yemen. Prince Sultan had already shown that U.S. personnel were vulnerable. Gulf infrastructure remained under pressure. Hormuz remained unstable. Oil had surged. LNG risk was rising. and Reuters reporting on March 30th described energy markets as approaching something close to a worst-case scenario if disruption persisted. This is no longer a contained contest of punishment and deterrence. It is a connected conflict in which every unresolved front feeds the others. For Washington, that creates a strategic trap. Escalate too far, and the war risks turning regional in the fullest sense. Hold back too much, and the systems now under pressure remain exposed, while adversaries prove they can keep inflicting economic and military costs without winning outright. That is what makes this moment so unstable. No side needs total victory to change the world outside the battlefield. They only need enough leverage to keep the system off balance. The international response has been intense, but uneven. In Europe, skepticism is growing. Leaders such as German Chancellor Friedrich Merz publicly questioned the strategic clarity behind the U.S.-Israeli war effort and signaled reluctance to move toward deeper military involvement without broader authorization or a clearer end state. In the Gulf, the mood is more urgent. These governments are not discussing abstract deterrence theory. They are discussing the vulnerability of the infrastructure on which their survival depends. When they described attacks on energy systems as existential, they were not exaggerating for diplomatic effect. They were acknowledging that a state built on energy exports cannot treat repeated strikes on those systems as peripheral. At the same time, diplomacy remains alive, but fragile. Pakistan has emerged as the most important active intermediary between Washington and Tehran. Reuters reporting described a 15-point U.S. proposal moving through these channels, while Iranian officials rejected its terms as biased and unjust, even as they stopped short of slamming the door completely. That is the paradox of this moment. Negotiation is happening, so is escalation, and neither has managed to halt the other. From here, three paths are visible. The first is stabilization. Pakistan's mediation gains traction. Washington and Tehran find enough common ground to reduce immediate pressure. Traffic through Hormuz begins to normalize. Insurance costs ease. Markets pull back from panic. The war does not end, but the system regains some predictability. The second path is wider escalation. Iran continues using direct and indirect means to pressure Gulf infrastructure and maritime routes. Israel expands operations further in Lebanon. Houthi activity in the Red Sea and against Israel becomes more sustained. The conflict stops being understood as one war with side fronts and begins to look like a regional system confrontation. The third path is the most dangerous. Miscalculation. A strike that lands closer than intended. A response shaped by politics more than strategy. A casualty event involving U.S. personnel at a greater scale. A maritime incident in Hormuz that changes market psychology overnight. In conflicts like this, it is often not the most dramatic planned move that creates the biggest escalation. It is the move interpreted differently than intended. And that is why the next phase may not be decided by who wants a larger war. It may be decided by who loses control of a smaller one. From here, three paths are visible. The first is stabilization. Pakistan's mediation gains traction. Washington and Tehran find enough common ground to reduce immediate pressure. Traffic through Hormuz begins to normalize. Insurance costs ease. Markets pull back from panic. The war does not end, but the system regains some predictability. The second path is wider escalation. Iran continues using direct and indirect means to pressure Gulf infrastructure and maritime routes. Israel expands operations further in Lebanon. Houthi activity in the Red Sea and against Israel becomes more sustained. The conflict stops being understood as one war with side fronts and begins to look like a regional system confrontation. The third path is the most dangerous. Miscalculation. A strike that lands closer than intended. A response shaped by politics more than strategy. A casualty event involving U.S. personnel at a greater scale. A maritime incident in Hormuz that changes market psychology overnight. In conflicts like this, it is often not the most dramatic planned move that creates the biggest escalation. It is the move interpreted differently than intended. And that is why the next phase may not be decided by who wants a larger war. It may be decided by who loses control of a smaller one.